Okay. So with that, I'd like to formally introduce myself as well as our speaker and our other panelists for this evening. I am Mark Bodicher. I am the Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Educator in Hardin County. And also joining us today as a panelist who's going to help out with our questions is Kim Thomas. Kim is one of our Master Gardener volunteers from Hardin County. And so our speaker this evening is Amy Stone. Amy is the Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator for OSU State University in Lucas County. Amy's specialization includes ornamental horticulture, urban forestry, and invasive species. Amy has degrees from Owens Community College and the University of Toledo. Amy's office is at the Toledo Botanical Garden, part of the Metro Parks Toledo system, a perfect location. She has been with Extension approaching 29 years. Amy and her husband live on her husband's grandparents' farm, and they have 2 grown children and 2 grandchildren. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Amy, and she's going to speak to you tonight on selecting plants to avoid invasive insects and more. So Amy, it's all yours.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so my title that I was given was Selecting Plants to Avoid Invasive Insects. And then I've got a couple little bonuses that I wanted to talk about, some plants that are on the radar. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started. With that, I am a member of our Buckeye Environmental Horticulture team, and we were formerly known as the Extension Nursery Landscape and Turf team. And we've got a great new website that has a lot of resources. And so just wanted to give a shout out to Ashley Kulhanick in Medina County for all her hard work on that. Additionally, part of the team's efforts includes writing for the Buckeye Yard and Garden line. And I know probably many of you are receiving the Beagle, but if you are not, this is a great kind of timely horticulture newsletter that goes out. And if you see here on the website, if you go to the website, bygl.osu.edu, if you click on here where it says alerts, that'll give you the opportunity to sign up for the real-time alerts. So every time a new message is posted, you get an email, or there is also a way to sign up where you would get a weekly email with a summary of that information. Additionally, I just wanted to give a shout out and a plug for our Ohio Woodland Stewards program. I'm also a team member of that group. There's a lot of educational resources, a lot of videos that have been recorded, especially over the pandemic time, and just a great resource. It says Woodland Stewards, but there's a lot of resources that are available for everyone. And we're going to end the program with ways to report invasive species with our Great Lakes Early Detection Network app. And there are videos that will dive deeper if you're not as familiar with the app and how to download and then use that. So check that out if you get a chance. But let's talk about why we're here tonight. And I have a few objectives that I hope to accomplish by the end of the evening. One is to raise awareness, increase your knowledge, and increase your understanding of invasive species and diversity and how those interact. I also, fingers crossed, would like to empower you to share and spread the word. And so something that a lot of Master Gardener volunteers are very familiar with, taking that knowledge gained and getting it out to the public. Engaging with others on topics related to invasive species, and then of course encouraging continued learning. And so one thing I always kind of talk about in the very beginning is, I'm going to give you highlights on what's happening in the realm of invasive species. But something big may happen tomorrow. And so some of the information could be outdated as quickly as that. And so really encourage you to stay updated on what's happening and where these invasive species are. I am going to hopefully make you part of or encourage you to be part of this invasive species army. And it may sound a little strange, but we really need every one of your help. We really want to encourage people to learn more about invasive species, engage in the outreach and education, and to everybody. The general public really needs to learn more about invasive species and how things can impact them personally in their own garden, but then in our natural areas. So as we move forward, we're going to do just a brief introduction about invasives, just to make sure that we're all in the same level playing field and have some kind of key definitions defined. We're going to talk about diversity, what it is and why it's important in our landscapes and our gardens, and even in the broader picture when we talk about our natural areas, sometimes managed by the national park system, state parks, and county parks. And we're going to do that through these case studies. And so I've chosen 4 insects to talk about tonight. And then we'll talk about a few invasive plants that are also on our radar. So let's just jump in here. And so, when somebody says native, you may already have a definition in your mind or a thought about what that means. And often when I encourage people, when we're in the same room, to share what that is, something that's been there for a very long time, something that has evolved and is from either a part of the country that has naturalized or has been there again for a long period of time. The next word is non-native. And so this is pretty easy, right? It's the flip side, something that's been introduced. And often that introduction involves human interaction, right? We're part of that introduction. Sometimes it is introduced for the best intentions, the best reasons. And sometimes though, it's a hitchhiker, something that we don't want, but that's made it through commerce because we are a global society. Now, there is also kind of varying degrees when we talk about native and non-native. And I like just to illustrate this by, if you were an employee with the United States Department of Agriculture, your definition of native would be something that's native to the entire United States. So if there's something that's native, let's say to Florida, even though we're not experiencing it here, it's not native to Ohio, USDA says, yep, it's native. And so they kind of take a handoff approach on some of those species. All the way down to the other end of the spectrum, where we live in Northwest Ohio in a very rare kind of global species area called the oak openings. And we have plant species and insect species that are in the oak opening region that really are nowhere else in Ohio or in surrounding states. And so especially when we talk about plants, we sometimes drill down to a genotype that has specifically evolved and grown in that area. And so that is a very different definition of native, very specific to the US definition, which is very broad. And so you may say, hey, if it's native to Ohio, that works in my landscape or garden, where other people may even focus down a little bit more for a region or area. Then, of course, we've got invasive, right? And so for something to be invasive, it actually has to be non-native. And that's a real important point to remember. Now, you'll see this photo on the screen right now. This is a European honeybee. So it is a non-native species, but definitely not invasive, right? So I wanted to illustrate the point that there are some non-native species that aren't invasive. So they very much kind of have moved into, our gardens and landscapes. They behave well. They're not invasive. They're not problematic. I also just want to illustrate, and I hope that nobody has this going on right now. this reaction on their skin. But some people are highly allergic to this plant that's on the screen right now, and that's poison ivy. And I've heard a lot of people refer to poison ivy as, oh, that horrible invasive plant. But I just wanted to make sure and kind of clarify that poison ivy is a native plant. And so although some people may not like it, especially if you are allergic to it, or if it's problematic in your garden or landscape. And so sometimes we may say, oh, it's invasive, it's bad. But realize for it to be invasive, it has to be non-native. So in this situation, I would call this plant aggressive. My next question actually goes out to you, and you can put it in the chat box if you want, or you can say it out loud. But do you think invasive species increase or decrease biodiversity? So you could type in increase, decrease, you could just yell it out. I'm sorry, I won't be able to hear you, but just think about it for a second. So do invasive species increase or decrease? I see a lot of decreases. I see Sue says depends. Yeah, so thank you for taking time and typing those in. I will tell you the answer could be both, right? Or in the case of Sue, and she put depends. So when that invasive species, no matter what it is brought to the country, is released into a new area, it actually increases biodiversity because it's a new species. But unfortunately, with invasive species, they outcompete, they take over, and often will decrease that biodiversity because of that aggressiveness. And so ultimately, you know, in the end, we're seeing a decrease of biodiversity when these invasive species are introduced or introduced into a new area. So let's talk a little bit kind of on that definition of what an invasive species is. And so when we think about it, it's an organism kind of growing or living outside its native or natural range. And like I had mentioned, it's often human introduced, and whether that introduction is on purpose or by accident. Invasive species also are species that spread rapidly into an unwanted area, often into native plant systems to the detriment of other species. So they cause harm or damage. And that could be, human health. It could be, it's just wiping out and taking over certain areas as far as other plant species or other insects in an area. So they have to cause some harm or damage along with that aggressive approach. I do also like to just remind folks that, sometimes we feel, and I know I've given probably hundreds of talk on invasive species, that it seems like it's a one-way street and they're all coming to Ohio. But it actually is a two-way street. And there are things that we have sent from the United States to other countries. And so they're dealing with similar situations. And one example is our fall webworm. So a native insect that's really not a big deal. Aesthetically, it could be a little displeasing when we see that webbing, especially later on in the season. But in China, they call this insect the American white moth. And it's very problematic, especially in their orchards. And so they have actually sent people to the United States to look at natural biological controls that occur here and bringing those or taking those to China for introductions to add that kind of to their management scheme to try to get this pest under control. So we really have to be cautious, not just in our own area about invasive species and moving them around, but globally, we have to be alert and not be, unfortunately, moving these from country to country. So I wanted to also just talk briefly about the importance and the value of diversity. And something that I think we need to think about as gardeners. And as a gardener, this gets me excited because this is kind of my free pass to incorporate additional plants into my landscape. So I don't have to have just my favorites, but I want to add in more plants to increase that diversity. And why that's important is in this case, and you can see the photos, is these are ash trees that were once standing in Toledo. So the photo to the left is pre-emerald ash borer, and the photo to the right is those trees totally infested and were killed by that insect. And I should have added the third photo, which is that same street with those trees removed. And so this really illustrates the importance and the value of diversity, and why, if we continue to kind of go down that road of monocultures, we have so much more to lose. Additionally, we have to think about these invasive species becoming monocultures and disrupting the overall ecosystem. And we see this with the Callery pear. And so a plant that horticulturally, many people have planted. You may see them between the street and the sidewalk in your own community. You may have some in your own landscape, but they've become very problematic, especially in natural areas along roadsides, especially. And yes, they're kind of taking over to the detriment of other plants, but we're also seeing an impact potentially on wildlife, including some things that we like to see, our bees, pollinators, butterflies, and birds. And so when we think about diversity, as a gardener, I like to think about having something in bloom in my garden year round, or maybe not year round, but at least seasonally. And so think about that as the impact that those have on wildlife and the importance of that. Now, if I would go back to this photo right here of the pears kind of in that background, how much diversity is there in bloom time? So it's a very short window, right? And so, these insects, these pollinators need blooms throughout the season. And when we have monocultures, when all the plants are in bloom at one time, that can really be disruptive. And so that's another way to look at diversity and the importance of that. So we've talked about what an invasive species is. We've talked about the importance of diversity. Now let's jump into some case studies. The first case study that I want to talk about is the gypsy moth. And I often kind of tease, it's the very hungry caterpillar. And if you've lived through a gypsy moth infestation or currently have caterpillars feeding in your trees, you know what those very hungry caterpillars can do. They have a pretty broad host range. And so especially if there's a lot of them, they will eat pretty much a lot of diversity in your landscape or woods. But it's true that their favorites, especially as early caterpillars and later instars, are oaks. And they also, especially in later instars, like our spruce trees, which is very detrimental because the evergreens just can't kind of push out new growth like our deciduous trees do. And in a single season, they can cause a lot of damage if they're feeding on trees like spruces. But let's talk just real briefly about life cycle. And so this insect spends its winter and the majority of its life as an egg mass. Those eggs hatch in the early spring. And if you're into phenology, it's the same time that redbud is blooming. And so these very small caterpillars hatch and they begin kind of moving out, trying to seek that food that's going to sustain them for the next few weeks as that they are in that caterpillar stage. These small black caterpillars will turn into these pretty large caterpillars that are very unique. And they have rows or pairs of dots. And you'll see by the head, they start out blue and then they transition to red. And so often when somebody hears about gypsy moth or it's in the news, any caterpillar that they see that season, oh, that must be a gypsy moth. But those key characteristics are really important for the identification because there are other caterpillars that can be feeding at the same time. But what's so devastating about the gypsy moth is that they feed and can totally defoliate trees in a single season. Right now, we're having some outbreaks and populations really across the state that people, there was an article in our Buckeye Yard and Garden line, and I've got people from across the state saying, hey, I'm seeing gypsy moth. And so it's one really to be on the lookout for. The good news in the world of gypsy moth is that you'll see 3 photos up here. The first one to the left is actually a caterpillar that's healthy. It was moving, it was feeding. And one of the characteristics, or I guess habits, that the gypsy moth has is that it'll feed primarily in the evening. And then during the day, it actually will come down and kind of hide out, take cover. And so this insect was kind of on its way down, ready to spend the warm portion of the day kind of hiding out, keeping away from birds and other predators that might be after them. And but what you'll see are these 2 other types of caterpillars on the same tree that I noticed, that living caterpillar. The first is a caterpillar that was killed by a fungus called entomophaga. And so you can see that caterpillar kind of has shrunk itself, and it's really hard. So I could reach up and touch that caterpillar and actually pick it off. Some people describe it as a hairy toothpick. So think of how a toothpick will stand right up, and so you could pull that away. The third caterpillar that I want you to see is this one that's folded over like an upside down V. And that one was killed by the virus. And so we've got some really good biological controls that seem to be working when we talk about gypsy moth, but unfortunately, it isn't enough all the time to reduce or eliminate populations. So we have these outbreaks. So this caterpillar on the left, if it can dodge the fungus and the virus, eaten by birds and other predators, what we're going to see next is the pupal stage of that insect. And so that's what we're just starting to see, at least in the Toledo area. So if you're south of Toledo, obviously that's probably happened a little bit sooner. And so in this stage, it can take about 10 days to 2 weeks, and we'll see the adult emergence. And just wanted to show you what those photos look like. So the picture here, the insect that's darker brown is the male, and you'll notice his antennae are feather-like. The female is white. She doesn't fly. She gives off a pheromone, and the male comes to find her. If they mate successfully, you will see then a little bit later, this female laying the eggs, and there can be 50 to 500 eggs. And so populations, again, can increase pretty rapidly when you have multiple egg masses. Now you're probably wondering, okay, how's she going to tie this back to this case study about plants and what to plant to avoid invasive species? And so obviously I mentioned that oaks are their favorite, spruce are their favorite. And so, you know, if you're in an area where gypsy moth is coming through or has established, you don't want all oaks or all spruce, because that's going to be a management concern. But there's a good story here. So early in my career, there was a gypsy moth outbreak in Toledo. And in that outbreak, somebody said, hey, Amy, I live in an area that have lots of oak trees, and I want to plant some other trees to kind of mix up that forest, that planting. What would you suggest? And I guess I would say that I was maybe young and dumb, right? And I was like, I went to the books. I said, you know what? Gypsy moths will not eat or do not prefer ash trees. You should plant some ash trees. Well, we all know where this story's going, because that same gentleman came and visited me about, gosh, let's see, it was, maybe 10 years later. And he said, you know, you probably don't remember who I am, but you told me to plant ash trees, and I did. And now we're dealing with emerald ash borer. And so again, diversity is key. Never think of one plant to add to that landscape, but mixing it up. Some people say, well, you know what? I've got a small yard. I can only pick one plant. How do I do that? Look around. What plants do your neighbors have? and make sure that if they all have maples, that you're planting something other than a maple to get that diversity, maybe not just in your own landscape, but in your surrounding community or the neighbors that live next to you. So just wanted to kind of just breeze into Emerald Ash Borer just briefly. There may be some folks that are on the Zoom tonight that have ash trees, that they've been successful, that they've treated those trees. Maybe they've kind of reduced the regular treatment because Emerald Ash Borer has kind of moved on. Know that we are seeing some populations build up in certain areas because we do have some ash still there. But if you look at this map that was actually from earlier this year, it's very widespread. And so this insect, unfortunately, has kind of moved out. 35 states are now dealing with Emerald Ash Borer. And of course, being that early core area, again, we lost a lot of ash trees as a result, but there are some trees that are still there. All right, so let's talk about Viburnum leaf beetle. I'm sure a lot of people on the call have viburnums that are growing in their landscape. And again, I just really want to focus on the importance of diversity. And so you may have your favorite viburnum, but let's not plant 20 of those and kind of mix up that planting schematic that you have a variety. And so just a little bit on the Viburnum leaf beetle. It was first found in New York in 1996. It was found in Northeast Ohio, so that very far corner of the state, in 2002, and has been spreading its way throughout Ohio since then. In 2013, it was found kind of in north central Ohio, the Worcester, Mansfield area. The following year, we found some in Lucas County, and that population is continuing to build and move out. This insect overwinters in the egg stage. And so that's important, good information to know about because it can help with the management of that if you have it in your own landscape. Unfortunately, both the larval stage of the insect and the adult can defoliate and feed on the plants. And I know especially folks in the Northeast have probably lost some viburnums as a result of this insect. And so it's one to really kind of pay attention on, and that defoliation can occur pretty rapidly when populations build. The females will chew small holes later on in the season in the twigs, and that's where she's going to lay the eggs for next year's generation. So there's one generation per year. So you can see an example of that to the photo on the far left-hand side. And so although we're not seeing them yet, these egg sites will be there until next spring. And so simply pruning and removing and then getting those away from the landscape will help reduce the population. You'll also notice the larval stage is kind of a yellowish caterpillar-like insect or instar. And it will feed, and a lot of times it feeds on the underside of the leaves. So you may notice holes on your viburnum, but you don't notice anything feeding. So turn that leaf over and really look for that larval stage of the insect. The beetles are brown, relatively small in stature. And of course, once they start mating, it's difficult to find just one single beetle. They're often mating and again, getting ready for that next generation. Curtis Young has done an excellent fact sheet on the viburnum leaf beetle. And so this is a great resource if you have viburnums in your county and you're getting close to where these outbreaks are, to educate and get the word out. Included in his fact sheet, he kind of breaks them down by most susceptible viburnums. You can see here arrowwood, both the American cranberry and the European cranberry viburnum. Those are probably the top three. That's what I tend to see them on. There's some moderately susceptible viburnums and then least susceptible. Now, am I telling you don't plant any most susceptible? No, but I wouldn't plant a lot of them, especially if you're in an area where this insect is kind of on the radar. So mix it up. Make sure you're not picking all the susceptible varieties, and then read up on that fact sheet if you are experiencing viburnum leaf beetle, to talk about those management options, including pruning those tips or egg laying sites to remove next year's generation. The next insect that I hope at least it's on people's radar is the spotted lanternfly. And the spotted lanternfly, you can see here, has a pretty wide native host range. It was first discovered outside of that native range in Korea in 2006. And so Korea has done a lot of research as far as biology outside of that native range, and the impact on vineyards and grapes, because that was very problematic, or continues to be problematic in Korea. In 2014, it was first discovered in the United States in Pennsylvania, not too far from Philadelphia in Berks County. It unfortunately is continuing to spread naturally and through artificial movement. And so this is a really important point to make. So if people are visiting areas where this insect is, you want to make sure that you're not bringing it back in your vehicle, in anything, let's say you're camping, so any of your camping equipment, because we don't want this insect to get established ahead of the front. And so we'd have to deal with that before, unfortunately, the natural spread gets here. It was discovered for the first time in Ohio last fall in Jefferson County, although there have been individual detections and individual insects that were found in several counties. And so people were really good about reporting what they're seeing. And all of those were hitchhikers. And the good news is, after extensive monitoring, it was just an insect that was found. And so it wasn't mated. It's not a reproducing population. But unfortunately, in Jefferson County, it is a reproducing population. And so it's one that they're trying to manage and trying to reduce, so it's not like wildfire that builds and spreads rapidly. So let's take a look. This one also has one generation per year, just like Gypsy Moth, just like Viburnum leaf beetle. And again, it spends the majority of time in that egg stage. We've had first instar hatch, so you would see these nymphs, and they're almost like tick-like, very small in stature. They're white, or they're black with white spots for the first, second, and third instar. And then you'll notice here in the fourth instar, there's this red color. And so they're getting a little bit larger. That red kind of draws your eye. But I would have to say it's probably not until the adult stage of the insect that people really notice them. And so often it's that stage of the insect that people alert, the authorities that, hey, I think we have spotted lanternfly. And so this is a great illustration that I wanted to give credit to Penn State. And so one that we use a lot in our teaching. So from 1 to 1,000, this insect is truly a nuisance, strictly in their numbers. And so can you imagine going out to your backyard and seeing these hundreds and thousands of these plant hoppers who are using host plants, feeding on those plants, usually not to the detriment that it kills the plants outright. It can stress them, but it's just their sheer volume and number that can be disgusting to many people. You can see it's very problematic on grapevines, and you'll notice in this photo where the insects are feeding. It's actually on those twigs and stems, on those branches and stems. And so they're not feeding on leaves, they're not feeding on the fruit itself, but they're piercing into that tissue along the woody stems, and they're taking that out kind of like a straw and ingesting that material. This was a photo that somebody from Pennsylvania shared after a treatment in a vineyard. And so you can see lots of dead spotted lanternfly. And good news is they are fairly easy to manage and control. But unfortunately, when populations build, there's just so much of them. There's so many of them out into the environment. Additionally, they do like other fruit trees. And so apples, peaches, pears, you can see them here. Again, they're going to congregate and feed on those woody branches or those woody stems. And so, that may be a little disheartening if you take the family out to the orchard for a U-pick or to visit the orchard in the fall and see, thousands of spotted lanternfly. And so again, they can feed in swarms and their numbers can become problematic. We're learning that they can also be problematic on hops. There's a concern of them feeding on maples and ultimately, are they going to impact the maple syrup industry? On a side note, there are some beekeepers that have noticed that when they have hives in areas where spotted lanternfly populations are really large, the honey tastes a little bit different. Some people have described it as almost like a smoky or a burnt kind of smell or taste to that honey. And so scientists and researchers are looking into that, but trying to determine, okay, how much impact is this insect going to have? So let's talk a little bit just kind of what this insect is and how to look for it. Again, it's a plant hopper. The adults are pretty large. They're about 1 inch long to 1.5 inches and about 1/2 inch wide. They're beautiful insects. And so something that really should be eye-catching to you. And again, they can move kind of in mass and they're not super flyers. They're more kind of gliders, but population numbers can build rather quickly. We're coming up on the season in July, mainly into August, September, when we'll see adult activity. So right now, if you're out looking, they would still be in that nymph stage. Even though I said they're beautiful, they're eye-catching, this photo really illustrates how sometimes they can kind of camouflage in. And so there are 12 spotted lanternfly adults feeding on this trunk. And so, some of them may jump out right at you, but there are others, again, that are camouflaging in. Those adults will mate and then the females will lay eggs. And they're kind of in a mass or group. Some people describe it as a chain or a row. And so she can lay between 30 to 50 eggs. And that's the stage where that insect overwinters, as I had mentioned. Once the eggs are laid, she actually will cover them up with this waxy coating. And as the season progresses, it kind of turns from a gray, shiny, almost cement looking to kind of cracked and weathered. And so that egg mass may look different throughout the season. You can see here a photo of an egg mass where there's some eggs on the very top of that mass that are still exposed to the elements. They weren't covered up with that waxy substance. This just kind of illustrates a couple spotted lanternfly egg masses. You can see this lighter one here, the darker one, and then this is actually a gypsy moth egg mass. So this poor property owner is battling 2 non-native invasive species. The nymphs, again, they hatch in the spring. They go through those 4 instars or stages. The first 3 are black with white spots. And then the 4th has that red in its coloring. So we're getting back to, okay, what plants do I want to avoid? And it's not so much avoiding, but again, it's that whole diversity. If you have a vineyard and you're growing grapes and that's your crop, you can't have a lot of diversity, right? So you're going to do a lot of management and monitoring for this insect. Grapes are kind of its second favorite in line. In Pennsylvania, probably the #1 host is the tree of heaven or Allanthus. And the good news is that this is an invasive plant. So one that likely nobody should be planting in their landscape. And hopefully if you have it, you're managing it to reduce the population or that host material for the insect once it arrives. Unfortunately, spotted lanternfly will feed on a lot of plants. And actually as nymphs, they'll feed on more plants, so greater diversity. And that can be anywhere. I've seen folks say that they've seen them feeding on basil in their herb gardens, some plants in their fruits and vegetable gardens. But then here you can see also lots of trees that are well within their host range in preference. So right now that list is about 70 plants. So again, just planting a lot of different plants in your landscape to avoid populations of monocultures. I had mentioned that their host preference changes with that development, and Tree of Heaven is a favorite, especially as an adult. This photo just shows you that mouth part of this plant hopper and how it kind of drills in to feed. They are stem feeders and trunk feeders. Again, they're not going to be eating the leaves. And then, whoops, again, this fall and into winter and then early next spring, what you need to be on the lookout for are the egg masses that can kind of blend in pretty easily. So be on the lookout. If you suspect that you see spotted lanternfly, please let someone know. I'm going to illustrate how you can do that through the app, but if you're not an app person, at least call somebody to let them know so we can let ODA and USDA know that we have a suspect site in Ohio. The other thing that you may notice, because they're piercing in as they remove that mouth part, often you'll see some sap flow. And so you can see that illustrated here in the photo, some heavy sap flow. Additionally, as they're feeding, something else is coming out that other end, that honeydew that can be attractive to sooty mold. And so often people see a collection of that and are kind of drawn in to see what's going on. Additionally, our wasps and our hornets are attracted to that additional sap flow. And so you may see them congregate near trees that are infested. And so if you see a high activity of wasp and hornets, especially later in the fall, again, it's something that you need to kind of look at and make sure that spotted lanternfly isn't there. I had mentioned nobody's going to be planting this tree. We want to manage it rather, but wanted just to give you a few photos of what Allanthus looks like if you're not familiar. Very stouty stems, very thick stems. It is a compound leaf. And so at the base of each leaflet, you'll notice, and this is something that's just key, are these glands or little bumps, raised areas here. And sometimes it's more difficult to see. So this photo, they're still there, but they kind of blend in a little bit, but you can actually feel them. Because sometimes people will get it confused maybe with sumac or black walnut, which both of those don't have those raised areas. The photo down here on the left is an Allanthus that's in bloom. And the female Allanthus or Tree of Heaven can be very prolific. So very smooth bark, that young bark here that you'll see. Why it's an invasive tree is that it's a prolific seeder. So there are male trees and female trees. The female trees are the ones we really want to go after first because of the high reproduction that can occur. 300,000 seeds per year. And so we want to make sure that we're reducing that stand. It can be a persistent sprouter and resprouter. So if you have Allanthus and you're going to manage it, you simply don't want to cut it down because next year you'll, instead of having that one tree, you'll probably have 50 trees. One of our specialists once said that when managing Allanthus, if you just cut it down, 50 or 100 or maybe 1,000 of its relatives are going to come to the funeral, and then you're going to have to deal with all of those plants. They do produce an allelopathic compound. Some people are familiar with that juglans that walnut does. This plant can also do that. So another reason that we want to manage and eradicate or eliminate this plant from our landscapes or natural areas along roadsides. I do want to give a shout out, and I know there's been a lot of programs. Mike Hogan especially has been doing some tremendous work on educating master gardeners about jumping worms. Just to remind you, really monitor if you suspect that you may have jumping worms, make a report. And then avoid spreading by sharing plant, soil, and mulch. In Lucas County, we have a plant exchange. We don't have any confirmed sightings of jumping worms yet, but I'm very concerned that gardeners are so giving and they want to share those excess plants. And once this becomes established or populations are identified, we don't want to be spreading it around by sharing plants that may have these worms or stages of these worms in the soil. And so Mike did an article in the Buckeye Yard and Garden line. I know that he has a survey set up for all of you Franklin County folks that if you're seeing those, you can report on that survey. But if you notice or you suspect jumping worms, contact your local extension office and make that report there. So those were the insects that I wanted to talk about. I do want to highlight just a couple plants. One is Oriental Bittersweet, and I really think we're seeing an increase. One, because this plant was, kind of sought after for the fruit. Crafters love to use it in the fall for arrangements. But unfortunately, the Oriental Bittersweet is very aggressive. It prefers sun, but I have seen it grow in dense shade. Some people call it the kudzu of the north, just because of its aggressiveness. The fruits are beautiful, right? They're very eye-catching, but unfortunately, the birds will eat and then they fly off and spread this plant pretty rapidly. The vines can climb more than 60 feet, and when they grow, they actually will twist around and they can actually girdle stems of other plants in an area as they try to grow up. And unfortunately, the Oriental Bittersweet is displacing our American Bittersweet, which many of you may have. And additionally, it's actually hybrid. There are hybrids that are developing through that hybridization. So we're seeing some plants that look like Oriental Bittersweet, but have characteristics of American Bittersweet. And we believe that those are those hybrids. If you have bittersweet and you don't know, gosh, is it Oriental? Is it American? Is it one of these hybrids? This USGS fact sheet really walks you through. It describes kind of the historical information about these plants, how it moved rapidly, how it's kind of taking over. And then there's a key on the back side where you can key out different plant types so you can find out which one you have. The other plant that I want to talk about is also a vine, and it's kudzu. And it is here in Ohio. And so we really want to get a good handle on where this plant is. I had talked about invasives and being introduced by humans, just like this one was back in the 1800s as a forage plant, right? It was introduced for all the right reasons. It was planted for soil erosion, and it does a great job. The soil really doesn't move once kudzu is established. It was very widely planted, and then in the 50s, it was actually removed from a permissible cover crop list. But at that point, it was kind of too late, right? The horse was out of the barn. It also has a compound leaf. I say it looks like poison ivy on steroids. These are some photos that I took up in Cleveland, where a population really began to get established. Very thick, very aggressive. You can see here the flowers that almost have a hint of grape smell to them. And then also the seeds that are there. So if you are seeing any of these invasive plants or the invasive insects, we really want you to report those. And one way that you can report those as we wind down on the presentation is this Great Lakes Early Detection Network app. It's a collaboration of multiple states. The University of Georgia has kind of led this charge. And it kind of, how it came to be, I guess, in Ohio, actually dates back to Asian longhorn beetle time, when we had our first detection of Asian longhorn beetle in Southwest Ohio. We really wanted to encourage people to look for that across the entire state. But as we sat down and began brainstorming, we said, gosh, there's a lot of invasive species that we want people to look for. And so Eugene Bragg kind of came in with his expertise and knowledge about aquatic invasives. Kathy Smith was at the table talking about invasive plants. I was there talking about the insects. And then Marnie Tichnell also joined in the conversation, was talking about wildlife. And so as we, got to talking and really trying to figure out what we want this app to look like, there was already work being done on this Great Lakes Early Detection Network. And we kind of jumped on the ship and said, okay, Ohio's in. So it's a free app. It's a fairly sizable app because there's a lot of information. You can also kind of navigate through the website to look for some of this information. So it's broken down in categories, and this is kind of a refresher if you already downloaded this, but hopefully if you haven't, I'm gonna engage you to do this in the future. But it has the categories that you can scroll through. And so maybe you're just focusing on plants, maybe you're just focusing on insects. And what's cool is you can create your own list. And so you don't have to see everything that's here, but a real focus list, a smaller list. So here you can click on trees. It comes up with a list of trees that, and it's all the states that are participating. So you may see a plant on this list and think, oh my gosh, I didn't know that was invasive. It may not be invasive in Ohio, but it is a plant of concern somewhere. So if it's a plant of concern in one of our Great Lakes states, it probably should be on our radar. It's a great educational tool because you can see those images, you can learn more about it through the info, and then you're going to map these observations that you're making. And they're using this EDD, or Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. So you create your own username and your password. And so this is kind of like it runs parallel or at the same time with the Great Lakes Early Detection app. And this is where you're actually making the report. So let's say I want to report on Allanthus or Tree of Heaven. I go out to the field, I'll take some photos of what I'm seeing. I'll click, is it acres? Is it square feet? Any notes that I want to share, it's one tree or it's 5 acres. That it's taking over the spot, and then I'm going to hit save. That report is going to go into the queue. And so what we found is there's people that are out in the field making these reports, and maybe they don't have the best data. And so it was eating up their data trying to make those reports. So it goes into the queue, and then once you get back where you've got reliable data, maybe wireless access, you just hit report or send queues, and then we'll get those reports all at once. If we say, yep, that's what it is, the photo was perfect, there'll be a map that pops up. And you can see that here, this little red dot near Akron. So what does this app do? It kind of keeps us in tune to what's happening as pests cycle up and down. So this is a great reporting for Gypsy Moth, because we see those cycles up and down, almost like a roller coaster. It helps us kind of determine where a pest is establishing along that leading edge. And this may be perfect for spotted lanternfly. So we'll be able to kind of watch it as those reports come in. Additionally, we also use it for new hotspots. And so one that's not established in many locations, and another great example is spotted lanternfly, right? And so we know where it's at, but there is the potential that it can be in a lot of other places. So you're reporting that. The one other great thing that I like about this app is that you can do negative reports. So let's say you're looking for spotted lanternfly, you're spending time, you're spending energy going out, maybe observing some Allanthus in your community. You report Allanthus as an invasive tree, but you can also report, hey, I looked on that Allanthus, I looked on that tree of heaven, and I did not see any spotted lanternfly. And somebody will say, well, why would you want a negative report? That negative report tells us that you're out there looking, and that helps us kind of fill in those gaps that, okay, we've got 100 people, we've got 100 volunteers that are out there looking for spotted lanternfly and giving us those negative reports. So negative or positive, we want all that information. So I've kind of thrown a lot of information out at you, and I hope that it was engaging. I hope that it was informative. I hope that you're taking some things away. You're increasing your knowledge about invasive species and the importance of landscape plants and how you want to diversify that. So we're not building host plants, host sites for these invasive insects once they arrive in your county. And so with that, I want to open it up to questions. Sue mentioned in the question, so I'm going to go ahead and answer this live. How do we get the app? So if you go to kind of whatever your app store is with your Android or your iPhone, just type in Great Lakes Early Detection Network app, and it should come right up, and then you can click for that free download. All right, so any questions out there? Or if you are already experiencing some of these invasive species that I've mentioned, you can also put that kind of in the chat. I always am interested, especially in these pests that are kind of moving across the state. Where is that leading edge? And so Viburnum leaf beetle is a good example of that. If you have Viburnum leaf beetle, you can type in that county where you're experiencing that. So can you explain when to use the unlisted or unknown category of the app? Sure. So, we're creating this list of invasive species that you should be on the lookout for. But of course, we don't know what all invasive species there are, right? We definitely have some on the radar, some that other states are seeing, but maybe haven't made it to Ohio yet. And so we can put those on the app just to get the word out, to educate, to inform. But sometimes, it's a homeowner who is out in their landscape and they see something that just isn't right. They're seeing a lot of it. They've never seen it before. And this has happened time and time again with invasive species. It's homeowners that make that initial find, that initial discovery. And so that unknown category, unlisted category would be something where you could take a photo of what you're seeing. It doesn't match anything else in the app, but you have this feeling that it's an invasive species. And so that's what you could use that category for. So Sue, it didn't show up. Okay, so I'm going to type it in here. Great Lakes Early Detection Network. The other thing so if you're having trouble, I'm also going to put my email. And you can always email me with your address, and I can try to figure out what's happening, why it's not showing up. Okay, so let me see. Robert's asking a question. What can you do to get the government to help with spray programs for Gypsy, I'm assuming Gypsy Moth? Okay, Robert, so the state of Ohio is actually divided into 3 areas when we talk about Gypsy Moth. There is the suppression. And so the suppression area is where we've had outbreaks of Gypsy Moth. There's established populations. They're kind of experiencing that roller coaster. So they may have outbreaks, and then it may be 5, 7, 10 years, they don't see anything, and then all of a sudden populations build. So that's the suppression area. There's a zone that is called the slow the spread. And so the idea is to kind of hold the line or actually push that leading edge of gypsy moth back. And so that occurs in that slow the spread. And then the final area is the eradication. And so we actually still have a portion of the state, so the southwest kind of corner, Cincinnati, and then it kind of goes outward, that if they find gypsy moth, they'll actually go in and treat it like an eradication program to kind of knock it back, eliminate it, so then that population doesn't build and expand. So we want to keep everything back behind that slow the spread zone. So you had mentioned about the government being involved. And so the government is the Ohio Department of Agriculture. They really work in all 3 zones, but that treatment is in the suppression and the slow the spread area, where you would apply to the state. There has to be certain requirements. So it has to be a minimum of 50 acres. The residents or the property owners have to want this treatment to be done. There has to be a percentage of forested area or cover. So they're not going to treat like a cornfield or a soybean field. There has to be trees or host material for the gypsy moth. And there has to be 250 egg masses per acre in a residential or populated area, or in a woods where there are no people. There can be up to 1,000 egg masses per acre. That application to the state has to be done by September 1st of the year prior. So if you've got an outbreak right now that you're dealing with and are contemplating, hey, I think we need the state to come in here and assist, your application deadline would be September 1st of 2021 for treatment for 2022. They would come out, they'd survey the area, they would make sure that area meets all the requirements. They have informational meetings or open houses. Their website has a lot of good information. So if you search Ohio Department of Agriculture Gypsy Moth, they've got a web page. Or if you have other specific questions, you can shoot me an email. Let's see here, let me scroll down. Is bamboo an invasive plant? Yes, it is. Now, there are some native bamboos to other regions, but what we're seeing primarily in Ohio are invasive species or non-native. So there are some bamboos that aren't as aggressive, or some people will plant them in containers to contain them. But yeah, you've got to be careful about that. Pat asks, what steps to take to remove tree of heaven? There is a fact sheet on how to remove woody invasives through our Woodland Stewards program, but specifically for Allanthus. Typically, the recommendation is to do a treatment on the bark, so a systemic herbicide. You'd spray on the bark, or you could do like a hack and squirt. But the idea is to start killing that plant before you remove it. Because what we found is if you cut it down, again, all that stored energy is just going to push up new growth. And so we're trying to treat to reduce the health and the vigor of the plant. And then once the chemical treatment is made, then you can go ahead and cut it down. But that fact sheet will be really helpful. It talks about what you need to add to the treatment to make sure that you're making a good application, and where to make that application on the tree trunk itself. Oh, great, Sue, I'm glad you found that on the web. All right, really some great questions. Thank you, I love questions. Ursula mentioned, let's see, you mentioned that gypsy moth egg masses at the time when red bud bloom. Let's see, are they? So gypsy moth caterpillars, actually, red bud is not one of their favorites. It's just the actual timing of both things. So the egg mass is hatching at the same time that red bud is blooming. They don't have to be tied together in any other way. But But unfortunately, I mean, red bud is a wonderful native plant. It's beautiful. They're edible flowers. I love red buds. But now sometimes people are like, now when I see that beautiful red bud, all I can think about is gypsy moth caterpillars. And so that's kind of the educational tie between the two. So beautiful native tree, wonderful plant to have in our landscapes and surrounding areas. But when you see that, if you are in an area where gypsy moth is, those egg masses would be hatching. All right. I don't know, Mark or Kim, did you notice any questions that I missed?
I just noticed that Carol says, I have found 2 tree of heavens in my utility right of way. How can I get rid of them? So you answered that question.
Yes, and that is a very common location to find Allanthus. And unfortunately, there's a situation in Lucas County where, gosh, it's probably been 15 years ago, I noticed one Allanthus underneath the power line. And when the utility companies came back to prune, because this plant is going to grow vigorously, I mean, it's going to get up in the power lines. So they, were trying to do the right thing. They cut it back. They didn't use any herbicide. As the seasons progressed, that is a whole block of Allanthus. So, I mean, it proves to me that cutting is just going to increase populations. It has to be partnered with or coupled with an herbicide application for success. All right.
Catherine mentioned that you can find the app, the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app, under Great Lakes EDN in the App Store.
Thanks, Kate. All right. Well, I hope that everybody took something away from this presentation this evening. And, as I kind of scroll back in my own mind when I kind of came up with some of things that I wanted to accomplish, I hope that it was engaging, that you learned something new, and that hopefully you're going to share that information with others, because I know, Mark and Kim, we can't do it all, right? And so we need the help of Master Gardener volunteers to really get the word out and raise awareness about invasive species.
Well, I don't see any other questions. Kim, do you see any other questions anywhere?
I don't. I see a lot of very positive comments.
Yeah, some people say I get too excited about invasive species.
It's like a plant pathologist gets excited about plant diseases.
Right.
Well, we certainly thank you for spending time with us this evening, Amy. Very informative talk this evening. And I hope that everyone who was able to join us live and anybody who might watch the recorded program later will learn a lot more as they watch it or watch it again. And with that, I'd like to mention, if you didn't hear me earlier, I will be sending out a link to the recording from this evening's program. And so all you had to do was register this evening, and even those people that registered but weren't able to join us live, they will also be able to click on the link and listen to the program in its entirety, or parts that you'd like to hear again. So again, Amy, I really appreciate you being available and speaking on this topic this evening, and very interesting information.
Yeah, the one thing I forgot to mention, and this is perfect for Master Gardener volunteers, we did receive some grant dollars with Spotted Lanternfly, and we're purchasing some Spotted Lanternfly models. They're in acrylic. It's a 3D printing of this insect, and then also ID cards. And so we're going to be getting those out to the county offices But if you can do any programming and outreach, we would really appreciate getting the word out for people to look for this insect.
So I know, Amy, you have some costumes of some invasive insects. So do you have one being planned for this new invasive insect?
So I don't have it yet, but it is in the works. Yeah, I've got emerald ash borer and Asian longhorn beetle. So spotted lanternfly will probably be the next.
Good.
And those are going to be, those are available if people have an event that they want an insect to make a, make an appearance. Well, thanks, Mark and Kim. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Amy.
Well, if there aren't any further questions, we're going to draw this webinar to an end. And again, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And Amy, if anybody would like to look for additional information, what's again the quick website where they could look for invasive species or plants that they can plant?
Yeah, so the Beagle would be a good website because we do updates on horticulture topics, invasive species topics. And then also I tend to put some links on our own website in the county, which is lucas.osu.edu. And I'll type that in right now.
Okay. Kim, do you have any additional comments?
I don't, thank you.
Okay. Well, with that, we will end the webinar. And again, thank you for your time this evening.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Probably should finish end recording.